Look at me, Ethan. The sharp, trembling voice cut through the soft music like a church bell ringing in the middle of a storm. Every conversation stopped. Crystal glasses froze halfway to waiting hands. The bride turned. The groom blinked in confusion. More than 200 guests slowly shifted their eyes toward the lonely man standing beside the ballroom doors, still wearing the same navy suit he had bought 6 years earlier for his wife's funeral because it was the only formal suit he owned. Ethan Brooks hadn't planned to be noticed. He had quietly congratulated the newlyweds, smiled politely at strangers who barely remembered his name, and prepared to slip out before dessert, convinced no one would notice his absence. That was how life usually worked for a struggling single dad. You learned to leave quietly. You learned to celebrate other people's happiness while carrying your own heart in silence. But the woman calling his name refused to let him disappear. Victoria Hayes, the CEO whose face appeared on business magazines across America, slowly rose from her chair near the front of the reception. Her elegant emerald dress shimmered beneath the warm ballroom lights, yet nothing about her expression suggested confidence. Instead, her eyes held something far more vulnerable. Regret, hope, fear. The room waited for her next words. Ethan simply stared, unable to understand why the wealthiest woman he had ever known was looking at him as though everyone else had vanished. Only moments earlier, whispers had drifted across the tables. Poor guy? Came alone again. Still wearing that old suit. His daughter couldn't even make it tonight. Someone else quietly joked that every wedding reminded Ethan of everything he had lost. He heard every word, but answered none of them. Silence had become his closest companion ever since becoming both father and mother to 9-year-old Lily after tragedy changed everything. He believed dignity often spoke louder than wounded pride. Yet Victoria took one slow step away from her reserved table, then another. The clicking of her heels echoed across the polished floor until even the orchestra lowered their instruments. She drew a slow breath, lifted her chin, and repeated with quiet determination, "Look at me, Ethan." What no one inside that grand ballroom knew was that this moment had not begun tonight. It had started 10 days earlier with a handwritten wedding invitation, a little girl's heartbreaking question, and a promise that neither of them realized would change all 3 of their lives forever. 10 days earlier, the invitation arrived in a plain white envelope tucked between utility bills and a grocery store flyer. Ethan Brooks opened it while standing at the small kitchen counter of the modest 2-bedroom house he had rented for nearly 7 years. The morning sun spilled through the window above the sink, warming the faded wood cabinets that still carried the scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon oatmeal. Lily looked up from the table, her long blonde hair tied into a loose ponytail as she carefully colored a picture for her 4th-grade art class. "Is it another bill, Daddy?" she asked with an innocent smile. Ethan unfolded the thick cream-colored card and quietly read the elegant script. It was an invitation to his former co-worker Daniel and his fiancée Rebecca's wedding, scheduled for the following Saturday at a country club just outside Nashville. He smiled softly. A lawnmower hummed somewhere down the block, while a delivery truck rolled slowly past their neighborhood. Life continued at its ordinary pace, yet something about Lily's question lingered long after breakfast ended. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned home carrying 2 grocery bags. As he stepped onto the front porch, he noticed his next-door neighbor kneeling beside a flower bed, carefully trimming white roses that lined the walkway to her modern brick home. Victoria Hayes wore simple jeans, gardening gloves, and an old baseball cap that hid the woman recognized by television anchors and financial magazines across the country. She glanced toward Ethan, smiled warmly, and waved. "Good afternoon, neighbor." Ethan smiled back with the same quiet kindness he offered everyone. "Beautiful roses," he said before carrying the groceries inside, never realizing that Victoria had overheard Lily's question through the open kitchen window that morning, and ever since then, she had been unable to stop thinking about the lonely father who believed he would always have to walk in his celebrations alone. Victoria Hayes had built an empire by trusting numbers that other people overlooked, but no spreadsheet had ever explained why the quiet man next door occupied her thoughts more than billion-dollar negotiations. Every morning before sunrise, while the neighborhood still rested beneath a pale Tennessee sky, she watched from her kitchen window as Ethan Brooks followed the same simple routine. He packed Lily's lunch in a small blue lunchbox, carefully cut fresh strawberries into neat slices, checked the weather, and walked her to the school bus carrying her backpack whenever it looked too heavy. He never seemed rushed. He never complained. Even on mornings when rain soaked the sidewalks or winter winds swept through the trees, he smiled at his daughter as though the world had given him everything he needed. Victoria had met presidents, celebrities, and industry leaders, yet she had rarely seen that kind of quiet devotion. At the office, hundreds of employees stood when she entered the boardroom. Investors listened whenever she spoke. Financial reporters called her one of the most influential women in America. But every evening she returned to an elegant house that felt far too large for one person. Awards decorated the walls. Success filled every room. Silence sat beside her at every dinner. One afternoon, her executive assistant, Melissa, placed another magazine on the conference table. Victoria's photograph covered the front page beneath the headline celebrating another record-breaking acquisition. Melissa smiled proudly. "Congratulations. Everyone is talking about you again." Victoria glanced at the cover for only a moment before setting it aside. "Are they talking about the company?" she asked quietly. "Or the person they imagine I am?" Melissa hesitated, unsure how to answer. Later that evening, Victoria arrived home after another 12-hour workday. As she stepped from her car, she noticed Ethan kneeling beside Lily's bicycle in the driveway. One training wheel had worked loose, and Lily watched carefully while her father patiently explained how every bolt mattered because small things kept bigger things safe. He tightened the last screw, spun the wheel once, and smiled. "There you go, ready to ride again." Lily laughed, climbed onto the bicycle, and pedaled slowly down the sidewalk before turning back to wave. Victoria stood motionless beside her mailbox, unexpectedly smiling at a scene so ordinary that most people would have walked past without noticing it. Ethan looked up and caught her watching. Instead of seeming embarrassed, he simply offered the same warm smile he always did. "Good evening, Victoria." She returned the greeting, but after he disappeared inside, she remained standing beneath the fading sunset much longer than usual. For the first time in years, the woman admired for seeing opportunities before anyone else realized she had overlooked the greatest measure of success living only a few yards away. And somewhere deep inside her carefully guarded heart, admiration had quietly become something far more difficult to ignore. The days that followed unfolded with the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. Yet each small encounter left an impression neither Ethan nor Victoria could fully explain. On Tuesday afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the neighborhood just as Victoria returned from the airport after another business trip. As she reached her driveway, one of the rear tires on her luxury sedan had gone completely flat. She sighed softly, glanced at her phone, and prepared to call roadside assistance. Before she could make the call, Ethan stepped across the lawn carrying a small toolbox in one hand. "Looks like you picked up a nail," he said with an easy smile. Victoria shook her head apologetically. "You have already finished work. I cannot ask you to help." Ethan laughed gently. "You did not ask." He knelt beside the tire and quietly began changing it with practiced efficiency while Lily sat on the front porch finishing her homework, occasionally looking up to smile at her father. 15 minutes later, the spare tire was secured. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out several crisp $100 bills. Ethan immediately raised his hand. "Please keep it." She frowned in surprise. "You spent your time helping me." He simply shrugged. "Neighbors help neighbors. My dad taught me that a long time ago." Before she could insist again, Ethan gathered his tools, wished her a pleasant evening, and walked back across the lawn as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Victoria remained standing beside her car, the untouched money still in her hand. The next morning, she quietly baked blueberry muffins using her late mother's recipe and placed them in a small basket outside Ethan's front door with a handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you." When Ethan found them before taking Lily to school, he smiled warmly and carried the basket next door. "These are too much," he said. Victoria smiled. "Then share them with Lily." Ethan nodded gratefully before adding, "My daughter will probably think you are the best baker in Tennessee." Victoria laughed, a genuine laugh she had not heard from herself in months. Over the next several days, similar moments continued without either of them planning them. Ethan carried heavy flower pots into Victoria's backyard before an approaching storm. Victoria secretly arranged for new books to be donated to Lily's elementary school library. Without attaching her name, Ethan repaired a loose fence gate, separating their properties. Victoria left fresh vegetables from a local farmer's market on Ethan's porch after learning he often skipped buying fresh produce to save money. Neither of them spoke about generosity. Neither kept score. Yet every quiet act built a bridge that no expensive gift ever could. Unknown to Ethan, Victoria had begun turning down invitations from wealthy executives because she found herself looking forward to something far simpler, the chance to exchange a few honest words with the gentle man next door whose kindness expected nothing in return. Saturday arrived beneath a clear September sky, and the countryside outside Nashville glowed with the warm colors of early fall. White flowers lined the stone walkway leading toward the country club where Daniel and Rebecca had chosen to celebrate the beginning of their new life together. Ethan parked his aging pickup truck near the back of the crowded lot, taking an extra moment to smooth the sleeves of his navy suit before stepping out. He glanced at the empty passenger seat and smiled quietly, remembering how Lily had hugged him that morning before leaving for a weekend science camp with her class. "Have fun, Daddy," she had whispered. "Maybe this wedding will surprise you." He laughed then, believing children often expected miracles where adults expected ordinary days. Inside the reception hall, golden chandeliers reflected softly across polished hardwood floors while a string quartet played familiar love songs that floated gently through the room. Waiters carried silver trays filled with sparkling cider and appetizers as guests greeted one another with warm embraces. Ethan recognized several former co-workers from his engineering days. Some welcomed him sincerely. Others offered polite smiles before returning to conversations about promotions, vacation homes, and investment portfolios. He accepted a glass of sparkling water and quietly found his assigned seat near the back of the ballroom. Across the room, another wave of excitement spread as Victoria Hayes entered. Several guests immediately recognized the celebrated business leader and hurried over to introduce themselves. Cameras from a local society magazine flashed discreetly, while event organizers personally escorted her to a prominent table near the newlyweds' families. Victoria thanked them graciously, yet her eyes wandered through the crowded ballroom until they quietly found Ethan sitting alone. She noticed the familiar navy suit, the gentle smile he offered everyone despite receiving so little attention in return, and the empty chair beside him that somehow seemed louder than all the cheerful conversations filling the room. Meanwhile, whispers slowly drifted across nearby tables. "Is that the maintenance supervisor Daniel used to work with?" one guest asked. Another nodded. "I heard he gave up a real career after his wife passed away." Someone else glanced toward Ethan before quietly saying, "He always comes alone. That has to be difficult." None of the remarks were shouted. None were openly cruel. Yet together they formed the invisible weight that lonely people often carry into crowded rooms. Ethan heard enough to understand the meaning without catching every word. Instead of reacting, he simply thanked a server for refilling his water and congratulated an elderly couple seated nearby on their 50th wedding anniversary. Victoria watched the exchange from across the ballroom, and something inside her quietly shifted. She had spent years surrounded by powerful people who demanded respect, yet the man everyone underestimated continued offering kindness without asking for recognition. As the master of ceremonies invited everyone to take their seats for the first toast, Victoria realized she was no longer attending the wedding with the detached composure of a successful executive. She was watching one quiet father slowly disappear into a room that had never truly bothered to see him. And for the first time she knew she could not allow that to happen. The first toast was followed by laughter, the gentle clinking of glasses, and stories celebrating the bride and groom. But Ethan noticed the room slowly dividing into familiar circles. Former executives gathered around polished conversations about mergers and investments. Young professionals exchanged business cards between smiles. Families shared old memories across beautifully decorated tables. Ethan remained where he was, sincerely happy for Daniel, yet quietly aware that he belonged to none of those circles anymore. He had traded promotions for school concerts, overtime bonuses for bedtime stories, and impressive titles for the simple privilege of never missing Lily's most important moments. He had never regretted that choice. Even so, there were evenings like this when the silence beside him seemed just a little heavier. Across the ballroom, Victoria listened politely as several influential guests introduced themselves. One successful real estate developer smiled confidently and gestured toward the empty chair beside him. Victoria, someone like you should not be sitting alone tonight. Please, join our table. We have been hoping to discuss a partnership. Another executive laughed. Or perhaps we should simply introduce you to someone worthy of your time. The group chuckled approvingly. Victoria answered with her usual professional smile, but her attention had already drifted back toward Ethan. She watched as he quietly stood to refill his water instead of joining any conversation. She noticed how he paused to help an elderly guest steady her chair before returning to his own seat without expecting thanks. Every small gesture reminded her why titles had begun to matter less than character. Then she overheard another conversation that tightened her heart. A woman near the dessert table lowered her voice just enough to sound polite. That poor man has been alone for years. Life must have passed him by. Another replied, nice people do not always get happy endings. Ethan happened to walk past at that exact moment. His expression never changed. He simply smiled warmly at both women and wished them a pleasant evening before continuing toward the exit hallway. Victoria saw something most of the room missed. Ethan was not going outside because he was offended. He was leaving because he refused to let his loneliness distract from someone else's celebration. She watched him slip through the ballroom doors into the quiet corridor where framed wedding photographs lined the walls beneath soft golden lights. For several long seconds, she remained perfectly still while conversations continued around her. Then she looked down at the place card resting beside her dinner plate. It displayed every achievement the world admired. Chief Executive Officer, keynote speaker, honorary guest. None of those words mattered anymore. She slowly folded the place card in half, placed it beside her untouched glass of sparkling cider, and stood. Several guests looked up in curiosity, assuming she was preparing to give a congratulatory speech. They had no idea she was about to make the most important decision of her life. The soft music continued for another few seconds before slowly fading into uncertain silence. Guests exchanged puzzled glances as Victoria Hayes stepped away from the head table instead of walking toward the microphone prepared for the family speeches. Her emerald dress brushed lightly across the polished floor with every measured step. She no longer noticed the photographers lifting their cameras or the executives whispering behind folded hands. Her eyes were fixed on only one person. Ethan had almost reached the ballroom doors when he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Thinking someone simply needed to pass, he stepped politely aside. Then a familiar voice, trembling with emotion yet impossibly clear, echoed through the entire room. Ethan, look at me. The words carried far beyond the marble walls. Every conversation stopped. Forks rested against dinner plates. Even the string quartet lowered their instruments. Ethan slowly turned. His calm expression gave way to quiet surprise as Victoria stood only a few feet away, her blue eyes shimmering beneath the crystal chandeliers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room held its breath. Victoria smiled softly, though tears threatened to escape despite every effort to remain composed. Please, she whispered again, her voice stronger this time. Just look at me. Ethan searched her face, unable to understand why the most admired woman in the ballroom appeared more nervous than anyone he had ever met. Victoria, he said gently, everyone is watching. She gave a small, almost relieved laugh. I know. That is exactly why I cannot stay silent anymore. Murmurs swept through the guests like a breeze across autumn leaves. Several executives exchanged confused looks. Others leaned forward, sensing that something entirely unexpected was unfolding before them. Daniel and Rebecca remained seated, watching quietly with warm curiosity instead of interruption. Victoria took one more careful step until she stood directly in front of Ethan. She looked down for only a heartbeat before lifting her eyes again. For months, she said, I have watched you believe that nobody truly sees you. Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. You think people notice your old suit? Victoria continued gently. You think they notice that you arrive alone. You think they see what you have lost. A deep stillness settled over the ballroom. But every morning I have watched a father who wakes before sunrise so his daughter never begins her day without breakfast and encouragement. I have watched a neighbor who helps people without expecting recognition. I have watched a man who measures success by kindness instead of applause. Victoria's voice quivered as she reached forward and carefully took Ethan's hand. And tonight, she said, her fingers trembling around his. I refuse to let you walk away believing you came here alone, because the truth is, I have been hoping you would finally see the person who has been quietly standing beside you all along. No one moved. The ballroom seemed suspended between one heartbeat and the next as Victoria continued holding Ethan's hand with quiet determination. Her voice remained gentle, yet every word carried across the room with unmistakable sincerity. The first week I moved next door, she said, I watched you spend nearly an hour teaching Lily how to ride her bicycle. She fell, stood up, smiled, and tried again because you never stopped believing in her. You did not know I was watching from my porch. Ethan lowered his eyes, humbled by memories he had never considered extraordinary. Victoria continued, the afternoon my tire went flat. You refused money because you believed neighbors should help neighbors. When I thanked you with blueberry muffins, you thanked me as though I had done something remarkable. Every time I tried to repay your kindness, you quietly turned the attention toward someone else. She paused, taking a slow breath before looking around the ballroom. Many people know my title. Very few know my heart. They congratulate me for every business victory, but none of those victories ever made me feel the way simple moments next door did. A respectful silence settled over the guests. Even those who had whispered earlier now lowered their eyes, remembering their own careless assumptions. Victoria smiled softly at Ethan. People see a successful executive when they look at me. I see a father who never lets his daughter question whether she is loved. I see a man who gave up comfort so a little girl could grow up with security, patience, and hope. I see someone who never measures another human being by wealth, appearance, or status. Ethan finally found his voice. It was quiet, almost hesitant. Victoria, I never wanted anyone to feel sorry for me. She gently shook her head. I do not feel sorry for you. I admire you. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her smile never faded. You reminded me that character is built in ordinary mornings, not extraordinary headlines. You taught me that kindness spoken in a whisper can echo farther than applause shouted from a stage. Daniel slowly rose from his chair, followed by Rebecca. Neither interrupted. Instead, they began clapping softly, not for a performance but for a truth that had finally found its voice. One by one, other guests joined them. The applause was warm, respectful, and free of spectacle. It was the sound of people recognizing the dignity they had almost overlooked. Ethan looked around the room, overwhelmed not by attention but by grace. Then his eyes returned to Victoria. I never imagined someone like you could see someone like me, he admitted. Victoria smiled through quiet tears and answered with a calm certainty that left the room silent once again. Ethan, I never wanted someone else. I was simply waiting for the kindest man in the neighborhood to believe he was worthy of being loved. 1 year later, the same countryside shimmered beneath another clear September sky, but this time Ethan Brooks did not arrive alone. Lily, now 10 years old, skipped happily beside him wearing a pale blue dress and carrying a small basket of white flower petals. Victoria walked at his side, her hand resting naturally in his, not because she wanted the world to notice, but because letting go no longer made sense. Their wedding was intentionally small. Family, close friends, neighbors, and the people who had quietly become part of their lives gathered in the same country club where everything had changed 12 months earlier. Daniel stood as Ethan's best man, while Rebecca hugged Victoria before the ceremony began, smiling through grateful tears. There were no television cameras, no business reporters, and no speeches celebrating corporate success. Victoria had politely declined every media request. Today belongs to family, she had simply said. As guests found their seats, Lily carefully walked down the aisle scattering flower petals with the same bright smile that had carried her father through his darkest years. When she reached the front, she looked up at Victoria and whispered, "Thank you for seeing my daddy." Victoria gently knelt, hugged her, and quietly replied, "Thank you for sharing him with me." There was not a dry eye among the guests. As the ceremony began, the minister spoke not about wealth or accomplishments, but about faithfulness, patience, kindness, and the quiet courage required to love someone completely. Ethan looked into Victoria's eyes and smiled with the calm confidence of a man who no longer questioned whether he belonged. "I spent years believing my greatest purpose was simply raising Lily well," he said softly. "I never expected life to give me another chapter. But you reminded me that hope does not disappear. Sometimes it patiently waits beside us until we are ready to see it. Victoria gently squeezed his hands. The world applauded me for building companies, she answered. But you showed me how to build a home. You taught me that success is measured by the people who feel safe when they walk through your front door. That is the life I choose every day with you and Lily. After they exchanged rings, applause filled the room once again, warmer and more joyful than it had been a year earlier. During the reception, Ethan noticed two elderly guests quietly helping each other walk across the dance floor, children laughing beneath strings of glowing lights, and Lily teaching Victoria a silly dance she had learned at school. He realized happiness had never arrived with dramatic fanfare. It had quietly entered his life one ordinary morning through the kindness of a neighbor who chose to notice what everyone else overlooked. As evening settled over the rolling Tennessee hills, the three of them stepped outside together. The golden sunset stretched across the horizon while a gentle breeze carried the scent of roses from the nearby garden. Ethan slipped one arm around Victoria and the other around Lily as they slowly walked toward the parking lot, their shadows blending into one. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding someone extraordinary. Sometimes it is discovering that the person who quietly believed in your worth had been standing only a few steps away all along, waiting for the moment when love could finally replace loneliness and dignity could become the beginning of a beautiful new family.